"On your knees, nurse, or I put a bullet in the next patient I see." The man drove his rifle barrel straight into Dr. Thorne's jaw. Thorne dropped like a rag doll, blood spraying across the white floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The gunman grabbed the nearest nurse by the throat and lifted her off the ground, her feet kicking air, her face going purple. "I said nobody moves." A second-armed man kicked the ER doors off their hinges. A third put his boot through the monitoring station. Chaos. Pure, violent chaos. And in the middle of it all, Elise Hargrove stood completely still. Hands loose, eyes cold, heart rate steady. They had no idea who they just walked in on. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if this is your first time on this channel, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens in that emergency room will change everything you think you know about the people standing right next to you. The name on her badge said Hargrove E. Just that. No title beyond RN. No indication of anything remarkable. She had worn that badge for 14 weeks, clipping it to her scrub top every morning with the same quiet routine, the same measured breath, the same deliberate stillness that people in her world called muscle memory and people in the hospital called being checked out. Houston Metropolitan Trauma Center was not a small operation. It was one of the largest Level 1 trauma centers in the state of Texas, a place that handled gunshot wounds, multi-car pileups, industrial accidents, and the kind of human wreckage that most people would never imagine existed outside of war zones. It was, by every clinical definition, a high-stakes environment. But to the staff who had worked there long enough, it had its rhythms. It had its politics. It had its hierarchies. And those hierarchies were enforced with a particular brand of cruelty that only emerges in places where exhausted, brilliant people have been grinding themselves down for years. Elise understood hierarchies. She had lived inside of them for most of her adult life. She knew how they worked. She knew how to navigate them. And she knew, better than almost anyone in that building, when to stay quiet and when to move. Right now, staying quiet was the mission. It had been the mission for 14 weeks, and she had executed it with the same discipline she brought to everything else. She arrived at 5:45 every morning, 30 minutes before her shift. She parked in the same spot in the east lot, took the same route through the service entrance, changed in the locker room before most of the other nurses got there, and had her first cup of coffee, black, no sugar, finished before the overnight team started their handoff. She knew which hallways had broken fluorescent lights that flickered. She knew which supply closets had sticky locks. She knew which residents ordered the wrong dosages when they were tired, which attending physicians cut corners on their documentation, and which patients in the long-term ward had family who never visited. She noticed everything. She cataloged everything. Force of habit. What she did not do, deliberately and carefully, was stand out. Her hair was always pulled back, but not neatly, just slightly messy, the way someone's hair looks when they don't think too hard about it. Her posture, when she was walking the halls or standing at the nurse's station, was slightly rounded, shoulders forward, not the full military bearing she'd spent years building. She laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny when other nurses told them, because laughter was a social lubricant, and social lubricant kept people from looking too closely. She deferred to doctors she knew were wrong about minor things, because being right in those moments cost more than it was worth. She made herself in every possible way forgettable. It was working. 14 weeks in, the staff had decided exactly who she was. She was the shy one, the quiet one, the rookie who was still finding her footing. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the senior residents, called her the ghost because she had a habit of appearing at the edge of a situation and then disappearing before anyone could assign her anything difficult. He meant it as an insult. He said it loud enough for her to hear. She filed it away as a compliment. The one person who made the job genuinely difficult was Dr. Julian Thorne. Thorne was 47 years old, chief of emergency surgery, and the undisputed sun around which the entire ER revolved. He was brilliant in the way that people who have never been tested outside of a controlled environment are brilliant. Technically precise, theoretically sound, and profoundly confident in the limitations of his own experience. He had gone straight from undergraduate at Rice to medical school at Baylor to residency at this very hospital, where he had risen through the ranks on the strength of a sharp mind and a sharper temper. He had never worked anywhere else. He had never needed to. He was also, in Elise's private assessment, the most dangerous kind of person in a crisis. A man who believed his authority was the same thing as competence. She had seen the type before, not in hospitals, but in other places, other rooms. She knew how to handle it. Keep your head down. Don't challenge him directly. Let him believe he's running the room. Wait. The morning it all changed started like any other. She got in at 5:45, parked in the east lot, took the service entrance. She changed, drank her coffee, checked the board. It was a Thursday in early November, and the overnight had been brutal. 3 trauma activations between midnight and 4, 2 of which had ended badly, and the kind of residual tension that settles over a team that has lost people sits differently than regular exhaustion. It's heavier. It has a particular silence to it. Elise recognized that silence. She moved through it carefully, the way you move through a space where you know the ground might shift. By 7:30, the ER was humming again. Not busy exactly, but alive. The way it gets in that morning window when the night cases are wrapping up and the day cases haven't started rolling in yet. She was at the nurses' station doing chart updates when Sandra Yee, one of the charge nurses, dropped a stack of files on the desk beside her without looking up. "Those need vitals cross-referenced," Sandra said. "All of them. Before noon." "I'll get it done," Elise said. Sandra walked away without responding. That was fine. Sandra was not unkind exactly, but she was efficient. And efficient people in charge positions don't waste words on pleasantries. Elise respected that. She pulled the first chart, opened it, started working. She was on her 4th file when she heard it. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic thumping that she felt in her sternum before she consciously registered it as sound. Her hands stopped moving. Her eyes lifted from the chart. She didn't look toward the windows. She didn't need to. She knew that sound the way most people know their own heartbeat. Rotary, multiple, coming in fast and low. She set the chart down. Around her, the nurse's station was still moving at its normal pace. A lab tech walked past with a sample rack. 2 residents were arguing quietly at the coffee machine about something that had to do with a chart notation. Dr. Webb was telling a story to a nurse named Carla that involved a lot of hand gestures. Nobody else had heard it yet. Elise took one slow breath. Then she stood up, moved to the window at the end of the hall, and looked out over the hospital's emergency landing pad. 3 Black Hawk helicopters were on approach. Not medevac markings, not civilian, military configuration, full olive drab, no insignia visible from this angle, but she didn't need insignia. She could read the way they flew, low and fast, the formation tight, the lead bird already flaring for landing with a kind of controlled urgency that said whoever was on board needed a trauma bay yesterday. Her jaw set. Behind her, she heard one of the nurses say, "What is that noise?" And then another voice saying, "Are those helicopters?" And then the charge nurse's voice cutting through, sharp and confused, asking someone to check with the landing pad coordinator. Elise was already moving toward the trauma bay. She wasn't running. Running drew attention, but she was walking with a purpose that she hadn't let herself use in 14 weeks, and somewhere underneath the slightly rounded posture and the forgettable hair, her body was shifting back into something it had never entirely let go of. She was 3 steps from the trauma bay doors when Thorne's voice caught her. "Hargrove!" She stopped, turned. He was standing in the middle of the hallway with his arms crossed, looking at her the way a man looks at something that has wandered into a space it doesn't belong in. He had heard the helicopters now. She could see it in his posture, the slight squaring of his shoulders, the tightening around his eyes. He was already calculating, already positioning himself. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" he said. "Trauma bay," she said. "Looks like we're about to have an emergency." "Yes," Thorne said, "we are. Which is why I need experienced staff in there, not rookies. Go back to the nurse's station and handle your charts." She held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than she needed to. Then she nodded, turned, and walked back toward the station. Behind her, she heard him bark at the charge nurse to get the trauma team assembled, heard the controlled chaos beginning to accelerate as the sound of the helicopters outside grew louder, and the PA system crackled to life with the trauma alert. She sat back down at the nurse's station, picked up the chart she had been working on, and positioned herself so she could see directly through the glass partition into the main trauma bay. She would watch. She would assess. She would wait. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. But plans, as she had learned over the course of a career that most of the people in this building would not have believed possible, had a way of falling apart at exactly the wrong moment. The first patient came through the trauma bay doors 4 minutes after the helicopters landed. He was on a gurney, moving fast, and he was surrounded by men who did not look like hospital staff. They were big, not just physically, though they were that too, but big in the way that people are big when they have operated in extreme environments for years, when their bodies have been pushed to limits, and their minds have been trained to function inside those limits without flinching. 2 of them were in civilian clothes. One was in partial kit, plate carrier still on, helmet in hand. They were moving with the focused intensity of people who were used to being the ones doing the carrying. And the fact that they were the ones doing the carrying now, that they were the ones on the wrong side of a medical emergency, was written in every line of their faces. Elise knew those faces. She had worn that face. She didn't move. She watched. The patient, she couldn't see his face from where she was, but she could see his vitals read out as the trauma team connected him to the monitors. And what she saw made her hands go still on the chart she was pretending to update. Heart rate 140 and climbing. Blood pressure dropping. The location of the injury, from the way the team was positioning him and the placement of the field dressing, was wrong for a standard penetrating trauma. Too high, too medial. With that blood pressure drop and that heart rate, the bleed was somewhere it shouldn't be. And the standard protocol for a chest trauma was not going to be enough. At the gurney's side, one of the men in civilian clothes, tall, built like a linebacker, with a jaw like a structural element, leaned over the patient and said something. His voice was low, too low to carry through the glass, but she could read the shape of the words. She had red lips in environments where making sound meant making yourself a target. He said, "Stay with me, brother." Something tightened in her chest. She set the chart down. Inside the trauma bay, Thorne had taken his position at the head of the table. He was giving orders in the rapid-fire cadence of someone who had run trauma activations 100 times. And technically, his orders were correct. They were textbook correct. Blood, IV access, imaging, intubation prep. He was doing everything that the standard protocol called for. Every single thing. And it was not going to be enough. She saw it in the trajectory of the vitals. She saw it in the location of the injury, which she had seen before. Not in a hospital, but in a dust-blown airfield 300 miles from anywhere with a name you'd find on a tourist map. She saw it in the way the field dressing was placed, the angle of it, what it told her about the entry wound and the likely path. She had been trained by people who had spent careers thinking about exactly this kind of wound, and what she knew, what she could see as clearly as if it had been written on the glass in front of her, was that the bleed was not where Thorne was looking for it. She stood up. She didn't go through the doors. Not yet. She moved to the edge of the glass partition, close enough to see clearly, and she watched. She was calculating the margin. How long did the patient have before Thorne's approach hit a wall? How long before someone in there recognized the problem? Was there anyone on that team who had enough field experience to see what she was seeing? She scanned the faces inside the bay. Residents. Good ones, technically, but young. The attending nurses were solid. Sandra had made it in there, and Sandra was sharp. But this was outside their training. The paramedics who had come in with the patient from the landing pad were already stepping back, their job done. And the men who had come off those helicopters, the ones standing at the edges of the bay because the hospital staff had pushed them out of the immediate work zone, were watching with the particular helplessness of people who were very good at a lot of things, but were not doctors, and they knew it, and it was costing them something. One of them looked through the glass and caught her eye. He was older than the others, mid-50s maybe, with gray at his temples and a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw. He was watching her with an expression that was hard to read. Not recognition, not yet, but something close to it. The particular attention of someone who is used to reading rooms and who had noticed that she was not, in this moment, behaving like the other nurses at the station. She held his gaze for half a second, then looked back into the bay. Thorne was calling for imaging. The vitals were getting worse. She had 90 seconds. Maybe less. She looked back at the man with the scar. He was still watching her. She made a decision. Not the big decision, not yet, but the first one, the one that led to all the others. She walked around the nurses' station, through the side door, and into the corridor that ran along the back of the trauma bay. The man with the scar tracked her movement through the glass. She pushed through the staff door and came into the back of the bay from the supply corridor. Thorne didn't see her come in. He was focused on the patient, calling out orders, working from the textbook in his head. She moved to a position just behind and to the left of the primary nurse, close enough to see the monitors clearly, and she looked at the readouts. Heart rate, 152. Systolic pressure, 78 and falling. The oxygen saturation was holding, which confirmed her assessment. This was not a tension pneumo, not the primary threat. The bleed was deeper, vascular, and it was moving fast. His pressure's dropping too fast for a chest wall bleed, she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. Or maybe she had. Either way, it came out with a calm, level precision that cut through the noise of the room in a way that her normal voice, the careful, forgettable voice she used in the hallways, never did. Everyone turned to look at her. Thorne turned last. He had a scalpel in his hand and an expression on his face like someone had just walked into his operating room wearing street clothes and started giving advice. Which, from his perspective, was more or less what had happened. "What," he said very quietly, "did you just say?" She kept her eyes on the monitor. His pressure is dropping too fast for a chest wall source. Given the entry trajectory and the field dressing placement, the bleed is likely posterior mediastinal. The standard chest decompression protocol isn't going to stop it. The room was very quiet. One of the residents said, "She's right about the pressure drop." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Who let her in here?" "The rate of decline is consistent with a major vessel," she continued, still not looking at him. "You need to reposition your approach. If you decompress the chest cavity right now without addressing the posterior source first, you're going to accelerate the bleed." "Someone escort Nurse Hargrove out of this bay," Thorne said. Nobody moved. The man with the scar was standing in the doorway now. She hadn't heard him come in. He was looking at her with an expression that had shifted, moved past the careful attention of someone reading a room and into something sharper. Something that said he was running a different kind of calculation now. The kind of calculation that you learn when your life depends on accurately reading other people. Thorne raised his voice. "I said escort her out." "Doctor," that was Sandra's voice, careful and steady. His systolic just dropped to 72. The resident who had spoken before, a young man named Okafor, the sharpest of them, she had noted that weeks ago, looked from the monitor to Thorne to Elise and back to the monitor. "She's right that the rate of decline doesn't fit a chest wall source," he said carefully. "I've never seen..." Neither have any of you, Elise said, because this wound pattern comes from a specific type of high-velocity impact at a specific angle. I've seen it twice, once in the field, once in a surgical tent. Both times the standard protocol made it worse. She finally looked at Thorne. I am not trying to take over your bay. I am telling you that if you proceed with the current approach, he is going to code on your table in the next 4 minutes. The words fell into the silence of the room like stones into water. Thorne stared at her. The monitor alarm went off. 68 systolic. What do you suggest? Thorne said, and the way he said it was not quite a question and not quite a challenge. It was something in between. The voice of a man who was, underneath all the authority and the certainty, standing at the edge of something he didn't recognize, and who had enough intelligence, barely enough, to know it. Modified selectively compressed hemostatic approach, she said, combined with a posterior access intercostal hold. It's not in your standard protocols. It was developed in a combat environment for exactly this wound profile. The room was absolutely still. Where, Thorne said slowly, did you learn a procedure like that? She looked at him. She had practiced staying quiet for 14 weeks. She had gotten very good at it. She had told herself she would stay quiet for as long as it took, that whatever she had been before she walked through the doors of Houston Metropolitan Trauma Center was buried, was finished, was a life she had set down somewhere in the dust and the dark and the smoke of a world most of these people would never have to touch. The monitor alarm screamed again. 64 systolic. She reached for a pair of gloves. Move, she said, and something in the way she said it, not loud, not aggressive, but carrying the absolute, unambiguous certainty of someone who has given orders in the dark, in places where the wrong decision meant leaving people in the ground, made the nearest resident step back without thinking, made the nurse to her left step aside, made Thorne, for the first time in perhaps his entire career, go still. She was at the table before anyone had consciously decided to let her there. Her hands did not tremble. They had not trembled in a very long time. Someone call the blood bank, she said. I need 2 units O negative on standby, not 2 minutes away, not in transit, here, now. She was moving as she spoke, her assessment rapid, tactile, reading the wound with her hands the way she had been trained to read it. Who has the ultrasound? I do, Okafor said, already moving. Good. I need imaging on the posterior mediastinal space, right here. She indicated the precise location, and Okafor moved the probe without hesitation, which told her something about his instincts. And someone get me a 12-gauge angiocath and a syringe, 30 cubic centimeters, right now. The room was moving. Not the chaos of a room that had lost its direction, but the focused, coordinated motion of a team that had found one. Thorne had not moved. She looked at him once, a fast look, the kind you give to someone to assess their status. He was standing 3 feet back from the table, still holding the scalpel, watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not anger, not quite. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked, underneath everything else, like a man watching something he had never been taught to expect. Dr. Thorne, she said quietly, I need you on the suction. Can you do that? A beat. 2. The monitor held steady at 63. Yes, Thorne said, and he stepped forward. In the doorway, the man with the scar had not moved. He was watching her with eyes that were no longer running calculations. He was watching her the way you watch something that you thought you had lost and have just found again in the last place you expected to look. His hand was resting over his sternum, over whatever was beneath his shirt, and his lips were moving very slightly, the way someone's lips move when they are saying something under their breath that they don't have the room or the breath to say out loud. She didn't look at him again. She was already working. The patient's vitals began to stabilize 9 minutes later. The patient's name was Marcus Ryle. She didn't know that yet. She knew his blood type. She knew his wound trajectory. She knew the rate at which his body had been losing the argument with gravity and blood loss, and she knew that the argument was, for now, over. His systolic had climbed back to 91. His heart rate was coming down. The monitors were still alarming, but they were alarming with the particular insistence of machines that had something to report, rather than machines that were watching a man die. She stepped back from the table and stripped off the first pair of gloves. Nobody spoke for a moment. That happens sometimes, in the aftermath of something that moved too fast for language to keep up with. The residents were still in their positions. Sandra was documenting vitals with her jaw set in the careful, neutral expression of a woman who had seen a great deal in her career and had learned not to let her face say what her mind was thinking. Okafor was looking at the ultrasound readout with the focused intensity of someone who was going to be thinking about what he just witnessed for a very long time. Thorne had not moved from the suction position. He was still holding the instrument. His knuckles were white around it. "His pressure is going to need monitoring every 4 minutes," Elise said. She kept her voice at its clinical register, calm, even, informational. "The posterior repair is holding, but it's not permanent. He needs an OR within the next 40 minutes. If the systolic drops below 80 again, the approach changes." She was talking to the room. She was not specifically looking at Thorne. "Hargrove." His voice was different now, not the bark he'd used in the hallway, not the cold command he'd used when he told the room to remove her. This was something else, something quieter and more complicated. The voice of a man who was operating without his usual footing. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that she recognized from a specific category of human experience. The expression of someone who has just had their entire understanding of a situation revised without their permission, and who has not yet decided how to process that revision. "Where did you learn that technique?" he said again. This time, it wasn't rhetorical. This time, he genuinely wanted to know. She held his gaze. "I learned it from the people who developed it," she said. "In the field." "What field?" She didn't answer that. She turned back to the patient and checked the IV line. Behind her, she heard the man with the scar move. He had come fully into the bay now, past the point where the staff had been keeping the military personnel, and nobody had stopped him, partly because of the look on his face, and partly because the room's entire authority structure had just been quietly rearranged, and nobody had gotten the new map yet. He stopped beside her. She knew he was there without turning around. She had always known where he was in the room. Old habit. "You stabilized a posterior mediastinal bleed," he said quietly, "in a level 1 ER, with no OR, no bypass, and 30 seconds of prep time." 40 seconds, she said. A pause. "Dutch," he said. "Carl Hutchinson. I was out of Coronado from '02 to '09. She finally looked at him. His eyes were steady. There was no performance in them, no attempt to make something happen. He was just looking at her the way you look at someone when you already know the answer and you're giving them the space to confirm it themselves. "I know who you are," she said. It came out almost gently. Something moved across his face. "Then you know why I'm here." She did. She had known it from the moment she saw the helicopters, before she'd consciously worked through the logic. The helicopters, the operators, the wound profile on the man on the table. It wasn't random. Nothing about it was random. And the fact that Dutch was the one standing in the room told her something about the nature of what had brought them all to this particular moment in this particular building. She was about to say something when the doors to the ER opened, not the sliding kind. The heavy double doors that led from the main entrance corridor, the ones that had a pneumatic closer and took a deliberate push to open. Those doors came open hard and fast, the way doors open when someone is moving through them with intent rather than entering. The sound of it cut across the noise of the bay and the monitors and every other ambient sound in the room, and it cut in a specific way that made Elise's head come up before her conscious mind had fully processed what she was hearing. Her body knew. Three men came through the doors. They were wearing civilian clothes, dark jackets, nondescript, and moving with the tight, controlled urgency of people who had rehearsed this. The first one had his weapon visible before he cleared the doorway. Black tactical pistol, suppressor attached, held low but ready. The second one was already scanning the room, his eyes moving in the fast, systematic pattern of someone trained to locate threats and neutralize them. The third went immediately to the wall panel and killed the main lighting for the corridor, dropping that section of the hall into the half-dark of emergency lighting. Elise was already moving. She was 3 steps away from the table when the first man's voice came out, loud and flat and absolutely certain of itself. "Nobody moves. Hands where I can see them, right now, every single one of you." The room froze. Most rooms did. It was a predictable human response to a sudden presentation of lethal threat. The nervous system overwhelmed the decision-making centers, and people went still, waiting for information, waiting for instruction, waiting for someone else to make the first move. She had seen it happen in operating environments. She had counted on it happening to other people. She was not frozen. She had taken those 3 steps and positioned herself between the patient's gurney and the first gunman's line of sight, which accomplished 2 things simultaneously. It put her closer to a supply cart that held, among other things, items that were useful in ways that the people who stocked it had not intended. And it removed Marcus Ryle from the immediate threat calculation. Dutch had gone still too, but not the paralyzed stillness of shock, the deliberate stillness of someone making a very fast and very careful assessment. Their eyes met for half a second. She gave the smallest possible shake of her head. "Not yet," he held. "I said hands." The first gunman swept his weapon across the room, and when a young resident, Okafor, she noted, moving on instinct rather than training, took a half step toward the secondary exit, the gunman covered the distance between them in 3 fast strides and drove the butt of his weapon into the side of Okafor's face. The crack of it was sharp and ugly, and Okafor went down hard, hitting the floor with both hands out, blood coming from his ear. 2 nurses cried out. Sandra made a sound that she cut off immediately. Thorne, to his credit, did not move. His face had gone the color of old chalk, but he was standing still with his hands partially raised, and whatever else Elise thought about Julian Thorne, she noted that he was not going to be a problem in the immediate term. "Everybody down! On your knees, all of you, right now!" People were going down. The residents, the nurses, the paramedic who'd stayed behind to file a report. They were following the instruction the way people do when they are terrified and have no framework for any other response. Elise did not go down. She was standing beside the supply cart, and she had her hands at shoulder height, visible, compliant in posture, and she was looking at the first gunman with the steady, evaluative focus of someone who was reading him. The weapon, the way he held it, the angle of his elbows, the position of his feet, whether he'd fired it recently, whether he was the kind of person who had done this before, or the kind of person who was doing it for the first time and carrying the specific, extra dangerous volatility of someone who was afraid of themselves. She made her assessment in about 4 seconds. "You," the gunman said. He was looking at her. "On your knees, now." She didn't move. Something shifted in the room, not visibly, not in any way that a camera would have caught, but she felt it. The collective held breath of 20 people watching a situation move to an edge. Dutch felt it too. She could see it in the micro-adjustment of his shoulders. "Lady, I will not ask again." "I heard you the first time," she said. Her voice was conversational, not brave. There was nothing performative about it, nothing that said she was trying to project confidence for the room's benefit. It was just the voice of someone for whom this particular level of threat had been calibrated out of the fear response a long time ago. The gunman stared at her. She could see him recalculating. She was not behaving according to the script, and people who didn't behave according to the script were either very stupid or very dangerous, and her expression was telling him, clearly, that she was not stupid. "This man is in post-operative stabilization," she said, nodding toward Marcus Ryle on the gurney. "If he loses a nurse in the next 40 minutes, he bleeds out internally. You came here for something. Whatever that is, it requires this man to stay alive. So you need me standing." A beat of silence. The second gunman had moved to the far side of the room and was watching the doors. The third was at the nurse's station, going through the computer terminals with the focused efficiency of someone who knew what they were looking for. The first gunman looked at the patient on the table, then back at her, then at the monitors, which even he could read well enough to understand that the numbers on them were not good. "Fine," he said, "you stand, but you don't move from that spot." She nodded, once, and turned back to Marcus Ryle's vitals. She was aware of everything in the room simultaneously. The positions of all three gunmen, the location of Dutch, the state of every person on the floor, in the particular way that she had been trained to be aware. The kind of awareness that wasn't about thinking, but about being in a state where information arrived without friction. She was also aware that she recognized one of the men. Not the gunman who had spoken to her, not the one at the nurse's station, the second one, the one covering the doors, the one who had gone to the far side of the room. There was something about his movement pattern, the way he favored his left side slightly when he shifted his weight, the particular way he held his weapon. Not wrong, not sloppy, but with the kind of habituated compensation that suggested an old injury in the right shoulder. She had seen that compensation before. She had been in a room with that compensation before. She didn't let anything show on her face. She turned back to the monitors. 93 systolic. Holding. "What do they want?" Thorne said. He was on his knees near the head of the table, close enough to speak quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, and it was doing something it had never done in her 14 weeks of hearing it. It was asking rather than telling. "They want him," she said quietly, not moving her lips more than necessary. "But not dead." "Then why?" "Because there's something on him, or something he knows, and they need him awake to get it." She kept her eyes on the monitors. "The OR transfer isn't going to happen right now, which means keeping him alive in this bay is on me." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" She almost smiled. "Keep being exactly where you are. Don't talk, don't make eye contact with any of them." She paused. "And when I tell you to move, move." She could feel him looking at her. She didn't turn. "Hargrove," he said, very quietly. "Yes. Who are you?" She checked the IV line. She checked the cardiac readout. She adjusted the oxygen flow by a small increment, just enough to give the numbers a nudge in the right direction. "Right now," she said, "I'm the person keeping your patient alive. That's enough." At the nurse's station, the third gunman said something sharp in a language she clocked immediately. Not English, not Spanish, something Eastern European. She'd heard it in enough different contexts to place it without being fluent. And the first gunman crossed the room in 4 steps and leaned over the terminal to look at whatever had been found. Dutch used that moment. Not to move. He was too good to move when the room's attention was split. That just collapsed the odds the wrong way. But to reposition his weight, to get his feet under him in a way that looked like the casual adjustment of someone kneeling uncomfortably, and to get his left hand 3 inches closer to the bottom hem of his jacket. She saw it. She said nothing. The third gunman pulled something from the terminal, a drive, small, slotted into the USB port, and held it up. He said something else in that same language. The first gunman nodded, and something in the quality of the room changed. The way a room changes when the thing that was being sought has been found, when the calculation shifts from searching to exiting. That was the dangerous moment. She knew it. Dutch knew it. The moment when people who had gotten what they came for started thinking about leaving, and leaving meant eliminating what they'd touched. She had 40 seconds. maybe less. She looked at Marcus Ryle's face. He was semi-conscious. The sedation was partial, enough to suppress the pain response without knocking him fully under. His eyes were moving behind his lids. His blood pressure was holding at 91. She reached for the supply cart. "Hands," the first gunman said sharply. He had turned back from the nurse's station, and he was looking at her. She held up what she had taken from the cart. A saline flush, a standard 10cc syringe preloaded with sodium chloride solution, the kind that nurses used 100 times a day to clear IV lines. "His line is clotting," she said. "He'll lose access in about 30 seconds. If that happens, I cannot deliver the medication keeping him stable." She held the syringe with 2 fingers, visible, nothing about it threatening. "This is saline. You can come verify it if you want." He looked at her for a long 3 seconds. He didn't come to verify it. She turned back to the patient, inserted the flush into the IV port, and cleared the line. Routine motion, the kind of thing that no one in that room who was not specifically trained would look at twice. What her other hand did while the syringe was going in was different, and it happened below the line of the gurney, in the space between the cart and the bed frame, and it took less than 2 seconds, and nobody saw it. Dutch saw the change in her posture, the micro shift that said the first move had been made. His hand was now fully at the hem of his jacket. The first gunman said something to the second, in English this time, which told her they were wrapping up, that the internal communication protocol they'd been using was dropping because the operational phase was ending. "Get them covered. 2 minutes." The second gunman moved from the doors toward the center of the room, and he moved the way she remembered, left side, right shoulder, the same compensation she had cataloged 20 seconds ago. He moved into the line of sight between her and the first gunman. She had maybe 8 seconds before that gap closed. She looked at Dutch. He was already looking at her. She dropped her chin, almost imperceptibly, the smallest possible signal, the kind that only means something to someone who has operated in environments where signals had to be invisible to be safe. Dutch's hand closed around what was under his jacket. The second gunman took one more step, and Elise moved. Not fast in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not a lunge, not a shout, none of the performance of violence that people imagined from the outside. Fast in the real sense, the way things move in actual situations. Efficient, targeted, committed. She covered the distance to the second gunman in 2 steps, her left hand going to his weapon arm at the wrist, her right elbow going to the specific point at the back of his jaw, below the ear that when struck with the right angle and the right force, produced unconsciousness in approximately 1.4 seconds. He went down. The first gunman spun and brought his weapon up, and Dutch came off the floor like he had never been kneeling, the motion fluid and instantaneous, and the gun that had been under his jacket was now in his hand, and the 2 men looked at each other across the room with the particular stillness of 2 people who had arrived at the same calculation from opposite directions. "Don't," Dutch said. The first gunman's weapon was pointed at Elise. She was standing over the second man she had just put on the floor, and she was looking at the first gunman with the same calm, flat focus she had used on the monitors 20 minutes ago. The same focus she had used when she told Thorne to move. The same focus that she had carried underneath every layer of the shy, unremarkable, forgettable nurse for 14 weeks. The first gunman looked at the second gunman, unconscious on the floor. He looked at Dutch, who was not going to miss. He looked at Elise. "Who are you?" he said. She had been asked that twice tonight now. She was getting tired of the question. At the nurse's station, the third gunman made a decision that she had approximately 1 second to process, assess, and respond to. And what she did with that 1 second was going to determine how this room ended. Her hands did not tremble. They had not trembled in a very long time. She moved. The third gunman had a problem that he had not anticipated when he walked into Houston Metropolitan Trauma Center 40 minutes ago. And that problem was the 12 inches of steel IV pole that Elise had pulled from the supply cart bracket in the same motion she used to come around the gurney, and which connected with his forearm at exactly the angle needed to separate his hand from the weapon he was raising. The gun hit the floor. He swung at her immediately. He was fast. She gave him that. And she let the swing come, slipped inside it, used his momentum, and put him into the nurse's station counter, face first, with enough force to crack the laminate surface. He slid. She put a knee into the small of his back, took his right arm up at an angle that made further movement a choice between compliance and a broken shoulder, and held him there. The whole thing took 9 seconds. The room was silent except for the monitors. Dutch had the first gunman at gunpoint, arm's length, weapon down, and the first gunman was doing the smart thing, which was standing absolutely still with his hands visible and recalculating everything he thought he knew about this assignment. Elise looked up from the nurse's station counter. Every person on the floor of that ER was staring at her. The residents, the nurses, Sandra, who had seen a great deal in her career and whose face said that she was revising the upper limit of what that phrase meant. Okafor, who was sitting up against the far wall with blood on the side of his face, and who was looking at her with an expression that had moved past shock into something that looked almost like recognition. Not of her specifically, but of a category of person he had read about and never expected to meet in this building. Thorne was still near the head of the patient's gurney. He had not moved during any of it. He was looking at her now with the particular stillness of a man who had been standing in a room for the last 9 minutes, believing he understood the hierarchy of competence present, and who had just had that understanding dismantled and rebuilt from the foundation. She kept the third gunman pinned and looked at Dutch. "You have the one at the door?" "Handled," Dutch said. He had not taken his eyes off the first gunman. "Zip ties in my left jacket pocket." "Someone get them," she said to the room. Not a request. Sandra stood up from the floor without hesitation. She crossed to Dutch, reached into his jacket pocket, came out with 2 black zip ties, and handed them over without being asked for further instruction. Dutch had the first gunman secured in under a minute. Elise had the third restrained a few seconds later, pulling his arms back with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a hospital floor. She stood, looked at the second gunman, still unconscious where she'd left him. Still breathing, she confirmed that automatically, the way you check things that matter whether you mean to or not. "He'll be out for another few minutes," she said. "Someone restrain him before he comes around." 2 of the residents moved. They were running on adrenaline and the particular kind of deference that emerges when a person has just watched someone do something that restructures the room's authority faster than any title or credential ever could. She turned to look at Marcus Ryle, 91 systolic, heart rate 112, holding. She moved back to his side, checked the IV line, checked the posterior dressing. The repair was still intact. He was still in the window. "He needs the OR now," she said. "The situation is contained. Get the surgical team on the line and get this man upstairs." Nobody moved for a second. Then Sandra said, "On it," and picked up the phone. Thorne walked to the other side of the gurney. He stood across the patient from Elise, and for a moment the 2 of them were just looking at each other across the body of the man they had both, in their different ways, fought to keep alive in the last hour. "Hargrove," Thorne said. She waited. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. His face was stripped of the authority posture, the default confidence, all the layered armor of a man who had spent 2 decades being the most capable person in every room he entered. What was underneath it was just a doctor who knew he had been wrong and who was choosing to say so. She nodded once. Accepted. He looked like he had more to say. She didn't give him the space for it right now. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't. And either way, it was not the priority. She turned to Dutch. He was still watching her with those steady gray eyes, the first gunman zip-tied and sitting against the wall behind him, and the expression on his face was one she recognized now. Not just the careful assessment of earlier, but something older and more specific. The look of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just found the person he needed to hand it to. "Talk," she said. He nodded. "Not here." "Then where?" He glanced at the restrained men, at the room full of staff who were starting to come back to themselves, starting to reach for phones, starting to do the very natural and understandable things that people do when a crisis passes and they need to make contact with the world outside the crisis. "We have maybe 12 minutes before this building is flooded with people I can't talk in front of." Elise looked at the clock on the wall. 7:43 in the morning. 14 minutes since the helicopters had landed. The entire thing, the stabilization, the gunmen, the containment, had happened inside the space of time it normally took her to finish a chart update and get a second cup of coffee. 4 minutes, she said. Then I need to be available for the surgical handoff. She walked to the small consultation room off the main bay. The room where attending physicians broke bad news to families. The room with the box of tissues on the table that everyone pretended not to notice. And Dutch followed her in and closed the door. He didn't sit. "The operator on the table is Marcus Ryle," he said. "Senior Chief, SEAL Team 8. He was carrying something when he was extracted. Not physical, not a drive or a document. Information. Specific, operational, the kind that people go to significant lengths to prevent from being delivered." He paused. "The 3 men you just put down are the second team. The first team hit the extraction site 2 days ago. That's how Marcus ended up with the injury profile you treated." She processed that. The drive the third one pulled from the nurses' station terminal wasn't what they were looking for. They thought Marcus had uploaded something to the hospital network during intake. He hadn't. He couldn't have. He's been semi-conscious since the bird went down. Dutch's jaw tightened. They were working on bad intelligence, which means whoever sent them is still operating on the assumption that they came away with something, she said. "Yes. And Marcus is the only one who knows the full picture, which is why they needed him alive." Dutch looked at her. "And why the people who sent those 3 are going to send more when these 3 don't check in." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, she could hear the controlled acceleration of the ER returning to operational speed. Voices, equipment, the particular orchestrated urgency of a hospital that was moving a critical patient to surgery. "How long," she said, "before the next contact attempt?" "Hour, maybe 90 minutes. She calculated. Marcus would be in surgery for at least 2 hours. He would be in recovery after that, vulnerable, accessible, surrounded by hospital staff who had just had the full scope of their inadequacy as a security detail demonstrated in real time. The building had one security team, minimally armed, trained for domestic disturbances and the occasional agitated patient, not for the category of threat that had just walked through the front doors. "You need the building secured," she said. "I've already made the call, but it takes time, and in the window between now and when my people get here—" "The window is my problem," she said. Dutch looked at her. Something moved in his expression, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude, but sat in the territory between them, the specific emotion of a person who has been holding a situation together alone and has just found someone capable enough to share the weight. "Valkyrie," he said, quietly, just her call sign, nothing else. But it landed in the room with a weight that 14 weeks of careful invisibility could not absorb. She felt it in her chest. The name she had set down in the dust and the smoke. The name she had come here to leave behind. "That name," she said, "belongs to someone who doesn't work here." "Does she?" Dutch said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the door and walked back into the bay. The surgical team had arrived to transfer Marcus. 2 attendings, 3 nurses, the anesthesiologist who had been paged up from the 2nd floor and who was moving with the efficient urgency of someone who had gotten the clinical picture relayed accurately for once. Elise gave the handoff herself. Vitals, repair status, risk factors, the specific parameters that would tell the surgical team what they were walking into. She gave it in the rapid, precise shorthand of someone who had communicated clinical information in environments where clarity was the difference between a patient making it to a surgical facility and not making it at all. The lead attending, a woman named Dr. Priya Mehta, who had never spoken more than 6 words to Elise in 14 weeks of working in the same building, listened to the handoff and then looked at her with an expression that said she was doing the same recalculation that everyone else in the building was doing this morning. "You're confident in the posterior repair integrity?" Mehta said. "For the next 90 minutes, yes. After that, it depends on what you find when you open him up." The approach I used was designed as a bridge, not a fix. "You'll see exactly what needs to be done once you're in." Mehta held her gaze for a moment. "What technique was that exactly? I've never seen a hemostatic approach like—" "I'll write it up," Elise said. "Full documentation. After." Mehta nodded once, with the respect of one precise professional for another, and the transfer team moved. She watched them take Marcus through the doors toward the elevator. She watched until the doors closed and he was on his way up, and something in her chest let go of a thing it had been holding very tightly for the last 40 minutes. Okafor was sitting on a treatment table near the east wall, holding a gauze pad to the side of his head. She walked over, pulled on a clean pair of gloves, and moved his hand aside to look at the laceration. Clean edges. No skull depression. The bleeding had slowed to the ooze stage. "How's your vision?" she said. "Fine," he said. "Double for about 2 minutes, but it's cleared." He was looking at her with the focused attention he usually reserved for complex diagnostic problems. "You knew where he was going to move," he said. "The second gunman. Before he moved there, you knew." She pressed a fresh gauze pad to the wound. "Hold this." "That's not something you learn in nursing school," he said. She stripped the gloves. "You need stitches and a CT for the head injury. I want you to go through triage like every other patient. You know the protocol." "Hargrove." She stopped. He was looking at her with something in his eyes that was not fear, not accusation, and not the dazed confusion of a man with a head injury. It was the look of someone who had just had a long-held theory confirmed, the specific, quiet satisfaction of a mind that was right about something it was not supposed to know. "I looked up the modified hemostatic approach you used," he said, "about a month ago, after I saw you watching a trauma activation from the nurse's station and noticed how you were watching it." He paused. "There are 3 documented instances of that technique being used successfully. 2 in field environments, 1 in an undisclosed surgical location during an operation that is still classified." She looked at him. "The operator in all 3 instances," Okafor said carefully, "is listed as a redacted designee with the call sign Valkyrie." Another pause. "I thought I was wrong. I almost convinced myself I was." He pressed the gauze pad to his head and held her gaze. "I wasn't wrong, was I?" The ER was moving around them, staff reorienting, the contained crisis releasing its pressure in the particular way that aftermath always moved. Too fast and too loud, every suppressed reaction coming out at once. 2 security guards had finally arrived and were looking at the restrained gunman with the expression of men who had been called in too late for the interesting part. She looked at Okafor for a long moment. "CT and stitches," she said. "Go." He almost smiled. "Yes, Senior Chief." She walked away before she could respond to that. Sandra caught her at the nurse's station. The charge nurse had a look on her face that was composed and professional, and doing a great deal of work to stay that way. She held out a phone. "Hospital administrator is on the line, and there are 2 people at the main entrance who are asking to speak to whoever is in charge of the current situation." A pause. "They have federal credentials." Elise took the phone, held it for a second without raising it. "What kind of federal credentials?" "The kind," Sandra said carefully, "that made our security guard step all the way back and not ask any questions." She raised the phone. "This is Hargrove." The voice on the other end was not the administrator. It was a man, calm, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who was accustomed to having complete information before he spoke, and who was operating right now in conditions where he did not have complete information, and was managing his displeasure about that with professional discipline. "Miss Hargrove," the man said, "my name is Caldwell. I'm with a department I'll explain when we're in the same room. I need you to understand 3 things right now. First, the men who entered your facility this morning are part of a network we have been tracking for 14 months. Second, what they were looking for is considerably more significant than a data drive. And third," a pause, deliberate, weighted, "we know who you are. Not who you've been for the last 14 weeks. Who you actually are." She stood at the nurse's station with the phone against her ear, and the morning light coming through the windows, and the sound of the ER moving around her, and she felt the 14 weeks of careful, ordinary life she had built in this building shift on its foundations, the way a structure shifts when the thing it was built to contain is too large for the walls. "Then you know," she said, "that I don't respond to pressure." "I know exactly what you respond to," Caldwell said. "That's why I'm calling instead of walking in with a warrant." Another pause. "We need your help, Ms. Hargrove. The network that sent those men this morning, they didn't come for Marcus Ryle's information. They came for confirmation. Confirmation of something that leads directly back to an operation you were involved in 3 years ago. An operation that officially never happened." Her hand tightened on the phone. "And before you tell me that person doesn't work here anymore," Caldwell said, "I need you to understand that the information Marcus Ryle is carrying, the information he has not yet been able to deliver, is about a target, not a foreign asset, not a network node." His voice dropped slightly, just enough to carry the weight of what came next. "It's about a person inside this building, someone who has been here longer than you have. Someone who knew those men were coming before they arrived." The ER moved around her. Monitors, voices, the ordinary texture of a morning that had already been the furthest thing from ordinary. She turned slowly and looked at the room. Every face she knew, every face she had been watching, cataloging, assessing for 14 weeks with the particular attention of someone who never fully stepped out of the habit of reading people for threat. Every face she had told herself she was done reading that way. One of them had known. She thought about the helicopters, the timing of them. She thought about the way the third gunman had gone straight to the nurse's station terminal without searching, straight to it, as if he had been told exactly where to look. She thought about the 14 weeks of being watched, the way she had occasionally felt the specific, practiced quality of someone else's assessment on her, the feelings she had dismissed as paranoia, as the residue of a life she was trying to leave. She had not been paranoid. She set the phone down on the counter without hanging it up and turned to look at Dutch, who was standing near the trauma bay doors, watching her with those steady gray eyes. He had heard none of the call. He didn't need to. He was reading her face, and her face, for the first time in 14 weeks, was not performing anything. "Dutch," she said. He came to her in 4 steps. "The mole," she said quietly. "Is it someone in this building or someone in your chain?" He looked at her. "We weren't sure until 20 minutes ago." "And now?" His jaw tightened. "Now we know it's in this building. We just don't know who." She looked at the room again. All those faces, all those people she had stood beside for 14 weeks, eaten lunch near, covered shifts for, quietly protected from their own oversights without ever letting them know she was doing it. Somewhere in this room was the person who had opened the door. "The 3 men in restraints," she said. "They need to be isolated before they can communicate a status update to whoever sent them. How long before whoever is waiting for their check-in sends another team?" 45 minutes, Dutch said. "Maybe less." She looked at the clock. 7:51. She thought about the name Caldwell had given her. The operation 3 years ago that officially never happened. The thing she had walked away from, set down, buried under 14 weeks of ordinary and forgettable and careful. It had followed her here. Of course it had. Things like that always did. You could change the badge and the building and the name on the locker and the careful performance of unremarkability, but the past had a way of locating you with the same patient precision you had once used to locate other things. She understood that now. She had probably understood it for weeks and refused to look at it directly. She turned back to Dutch. "Get Caldwell in here," she said, "and get me everything Marcus Ryle was carrying that wasn't on a drive." She paused. Everything he said during transport, every word. Dutch pulled out his phone. "He said one thing," he said. "When we were in the Bird, just before he lost consciousness." He looked at her. "He said your name." The word landed in the room between them. Not the name on the badge, not Hargrove. The other name. The one that 3 documented surgical instances in classified files carried at the top of the record. The one that Okafor had spoken quietly from a treatment table not 10 minutes ago like a key turning in a lock. Valkyrie. She looked at the clock again. 43 minutes. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her heart rate was exactly what it should be. Something inside her that had been carefully, deliberately quiet for 14 weeks was fully awake now, and it did not feel like the thing she had been afraid it would feel like when she had worked so hard to keep it down. It felt like clarity. "All right," she said, and she moved. Caldwell walked through the ER doors at 7:56, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent enough years in rooms where the official version of events was being written to have developed a permanent quality of watchfulness, the kind that other watchful people recognized on sight, and everyone else just found vaguely unsettling without being able to say why. He was medium height, medium build, the kind of forgettable physical profile that Elise recognized as deliberate. He wore a gray suit that said federal, but not military, and he moved through the controlled chaos of the post-incident ER with the careful, observant pace of someone taking inventory. He saw her immediately. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the person who came in behind him. She was a woman, late 40s, silver threading through dark hair that she wore pulled back tight, and she was moving with a precision that Elise clocked in the first half second as something beyond civilian training. The way her eyes swept the room on entry, left to right, threat assessment, not curiosity. The way she positioned herself relative to Caldwell, one step back, slightly left, covering his blind side without appearing to. The way she noticed Elise noticing her and did not react to being noticed, which was itself a reaction of the most informed kind. Elise kept her face neutral. Caldwell extended his hand. "Miss Hargrove? Or would you prefer—" "Hargrove is fine," she said and shook it once. "You said 14 months. Tell me the full picture." He glanced at Dutch, who was standing 3 feet away. "You trust him?" "With my life," she said. "Literally, on multiple occasions." Caldwell nodded. He pulled a tablet from inside his jacket and turned it so she could see the screen. On it was a network diagram, nodes and connections, the kind of visual that intelligence analysts produced to show relationships between people and organizations and events. She scanned it in the rapid, comprehensive way she had been trained to read operational data, and what she saw in the first 10 seconds made something cold move through her chest. "Meridian," she said. Caldwell's expression shifted slightly. "You recognize it." "I recognize the structure." She looked up from the tablet. 3 years ago, the operation that didn't happen. "You shut down the eastern node," Caldwell said, "completely, which we assessed at the time as a significant disruption to their operational capacity." He paused. "We were wrong about the word significant. What you actually did was remove the node they wanted removed. They let it happen. The Eastern network was a liability they were ready to cut. Your operation gave them a clean exit." She looked at him. "You're telling me we were played?" "I'm telling you that what happened 3 years ago was the opening move of something considerably larger, and that the person who designed that opening move has been inside the intelligence community long enough to have anticipated your team's response and engineered it. He took the tablet back. Marcus Ryle spent the last 6 months building the case, tracing the architecture back to the source. He got a name. One name, Dutch said. His voice was tight. One person at the center of all of it. And that name, Elise said, leads back to this building. The name leads to this hospital specifically, Caldwell said. Not the building generally. This facility, someone who has been embedded here long enough to have established cover, built relationships, and positioned themselves to monitor and report on a very specific category of patient. She thought about what she knew. Military personnel transfer through this facility, operators occasionally, when the nature of their injuries required a civilian cover story for the treatment location. She had noticed it, quietly, in her 14 weeks. The occasional patient whose chart had gaps, whose visitors signed in with names that didn't match their faces, whose injuries told a story that the official documentation didn't. She had noticed it. She had filed it. She had told herself it was not her problem anymore. "How long has the asset been in place?" she said. "We believe 4 years," Caldwell said. "Possibly longer." 4 years. She ran through the implications of that. The scope of what 4 years of embedded access in a level 1 trauma center that occasionally handled sensitive military patients would provide. Patient information, transfer schedules, injury profiles that could be used to assess operational activity. The kind of intelligence that didn't look like intelligence until you assembled it into a pattern. And by the time you assembled the pattern, the damage was done. "Who knows about this?" she said. "In this building? Right now? You, Dutch, and me." Caldwell looked at her steadily. "And whoever the asset is." The clock on the wall said 8:03, 38 minutes. "The 3 men in restraints," she said. "They're still in the bay?" "Hospital security has them isolated in the secondary exam room," Dutch said. "The federal team Caldwell called is en route, but won't be here for another 20 minutes. "Which means we have a window," she said, "before the asset knows the 3 of them didn't complete the mission and didn't make contact, before they start making their own exit plan." She looked at Caldwell. "You want me to find them before they run?" "I want you to identify them," Caldwell said carefully. "Everything after that is my team's jurisdiction." She almost said something about jurisdiction. She decided it wasn't worth the time. "The woman who came in with you," Elise said, "she's not a field agent." Caldwell paused. "Just briefly." "No. She moves like someone with a longer training background than civilian intelligence. Special operations adjacent. She's been watching me since she walked in the way someone watches a person they've been briefed on." Elise looked at him. "Who is she?" Caldwell glanced back. The woman was standing near the entrance, maintaining her observation position, and when she felt their attention, she walked over with the unhurried directness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. "Claire Weston," the woman said. She did not offer her hand. "I was Marcus Ryle's handler for the last 18 months. "You built the case with him," Elise said. "He built it. I kept him alive long enough to get this far." Something moved in Weston's expression. A tightness around the eyes that said the last part of that sentence was not as complete as she needed it to be. "He trusted me with one piece of information he didn't give to anyone else. The name. In case something happened to him before he could deliver it in person." "Tell me," Elise said. Weston looked at her for a moment. Then she said a name. Elise went very still. The name was Dr. Patricia Hale, Chief of Nursing Administration. 12 years at Houston Metropolitan. Respected, competent, the architect of half the hospital's current triage protocols. The woman who had hired Elise 14 weeks ago after a brief and pleasant interview in which she had asked intelligent questions, expressed appropriate confidence in Elise's nursing credentials, and assigned her to the ER with the specific instruction to report directly to Sandra Yee, the woman who had put her, specifically, in the one unit of the hospital where sensitive military patients were most likely to come through. She thought about that placement now with new eyes. She had assumed it was random assignment, or at best the kind of bureaucratic intuition that put competent people where the work was hardest. She understood now that it was neither of those things. She had been placed where she could be watched. Her cover had been penetrated before she ever put on the badge. She had been the Eastern Node. "She knows who I am," Elise said. It wasn't a question. "She's known since before you were hired," Weston said. Dutch let out a breath that was not quite a word, but carried the weight of one. Elise processed the full geometry of it. Patricia Hale had hired her knowing exactly who she was and what she had done 3 years ago, had placed her in the ER, had kept her close, invisible, and contained, had watched her for 14 weeks while Elise had been carefully performing unremarkability, believing herself hidden, not understanding that she was in fact the most visible person in the building to the one person who mattered. And when Marcus Ryle arrived this morning, when the helicopters landed and the wounded operator came through the doors, carrying information that could end Hale's operation and put her in a federal facility for the rest of her life, Hale had made the call, sent the 3 men in, tried to retrieve the information and eliminate the threat before Ryle could deliver the name. The 3 men failing meant Hale was already running her exit calculation. 8:09. "Where is she right now?" Elise said. "That's the problem," Caldwell said. "She's not in her office. She was in the building 40 minutes ago. Her key card logged entry to the administrative floor at 7:22. Since then, nothing." "She's still here," Elise said immediately. "You can't know. The 3 men she sent don't know they failed. She's waiting for their confirmation. She won't move until she gets it, or until she's certain she needs to run." Elise thought fast. She'll have a secondary exit plan. She'll have had one from the beginning. But she won't activate it until the last possible moment, because activating it means burning a cover she spent 4 years building. That's not a small thing to walk away from. She looked at Caldwell. She's in this building. She's waiting. And she has a communication channel to those 3 men that doesn't go through the hospital system. "How do you know that?" Weston said. "Because if I were her," Elise said, "that's exactly what I would have." A beat of silence. Then Dutch said, "So we use it." She had already been thinking the same thing. One of the 3 men in the secondary exam room has a secondary device. Not the weapon. Something smaller. A phone. A pager. Something that looks like it belongs. Something they'd carry without it reading as unusual in a hospital environment. She looked at Dutch. "I need 5 minutes with them." Caldwell started to object. She could see it forming in his expression, the instinct to manage the operational process, to keep the lines of jurisdiction clean. 4 minutes, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. She went to the secondary exam room with Dutch at her back, and when she opened the door, the 3 men looked at her with varying degrees of hostility and calculation. The third one, whose face had made significant acquaintance with the nurse's station counter, was not at his most composed. The first one, the one who had been giving orders, was doing the professional thing of maintaining composure and revealing nothing. The second one, who had been unconscious and was now awake, looked at her and she saw it. Just for half a second, a flicker in his eyes before his training shut it down. Recognition. He knew exactly who she was. Not Hargrove, the other one. She looked at him. "You know my call sign," she said, "which means you were briefed. Which means whoever briefed you told you I was the primary threat in this building, not the operator on the table." She paused. "They put you in this room knowing you were likely to encounter me, and they sent you anyway." She let that sit for a moment. Think about what that means for how much your handler values your operational life. The second man's jaw tightened. "You have a secondary device," she said. "Not on you. You're smart enough to have dropped it somewhere in the building before they contained you. Somewhere accessible. somewhere you could reach it if you needed to. She moved slightly, not threatening, just repositioning so he had to track her, had to engage. Tell me where it is and I will personally ensure your legal processing goes through channels that do not involve the people who sent you. And if I don't, he said, then those channels decide for themselves, she said. And the people who sent you find out through their own network that you failed, which means they spend the next several years making sure you can never speak to anyone who matters. She paused. Either way, I find the device. The only question is whether you're useful when I do. The room was quiet. First man, professional to the end, said nothing. Third man was in too much pain to be strategic. The second man looked at the floor, did his calculation, and looked back up. Stairwell B, he said. Third floor landing, behind the fire hose cabinet, taped to the back. 816. She was out of the room before he finished the sentence. Dutch 2 steps behind her, and they hit the stairwell at a pace that was not running, but was everything short of it. Third floor landing, fire hose cabinet, and there it was. A flat black device the size of a credit card, taped exactly where he said, the kind of secondary communicator that looked like a building access key fob to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. One message waiting. She looked at the screen. 4 words, sent at 8:01, 15 minutes ago, before Hale knew the operation had failed. The message said, confirm, package secured, exit. And below it, unread, a response sent at 8:14. Negative, standby, alternate. The exit plan was activating. She had read Hale correctly. The woman was still in the building, recalibrating, buying herself the minimum time she needed to execute a secondary exit. And the word alternate meant the primary route was blown and she was moving to the backup. She's moving, Elise said. Dutch looked at the screen. Where? She thought about the building. 12 years of Patricia Hale in this building. 12 years of walking these halls, building protocols, knowing every access point and camera location and staff schedule and delivery window. 12 years of quietly, patiently, building the most complete possible knowledge of every exit this structure had. She would not use the main entrance, not the ER bay, not the administrative elevator, which was logged invisible. She would use something that wasn't on the official floor plan, or something that was on it but hadn't been used in long enough that nobody would think to watch it. The loading dock, Elise said, sub-basement level. It services the morgue and the medical waste facility. Staff uses it maybe 3 times a week. No cameras on the interior ramp. They've been offline for 6 months. Maintenance ticket still pending. She looked at Dutch. I know because I filed the ticket. I noticed the coverage gap in week 2, and I reported it through the proper channels, and nothing happened. Dutch was already moving. How do you get there from admin? Service elevator to sub-basement, left corridor, through the biohazard staging area to the loading dock. She was moving with him. 4 minutes from the administrative floor if you're not rushing, less if you are. They went. The service elevator was slow, the kind of institutional slow that felt, at 8:19 in the morning with a 45-minute countdown burning down to something under 20, like a deliberate act of opposition. She used the time to think about Patricia Hale, not tactically, not as an asset profile, but as a person. 12 years. That was not a short deployment. That was a life, built carefully and specifically in a place where it could be useful, but a life nonetheless. You could not spend 12 years in a building without the building getting into you, without the people in it becoming something more than operational context. Hale knew Sandra. Hale had hired her, probably, not just for her administrative competence, but because Sandra was the kind of charge nurse who would make a good information source without knowing she was one. Hale had eaten in the cafeteria every Tuesday with a group of nursing administrators. She had attended the hospital Christmas party for 11 consecutive years. What did you do with 12 years of a life you built on a lie? What did it weigh? She wasn't sure why she was thinking about it, Empathy was not useful right now, but it was there, the way it was always there with her. The capacity to understand the interior of another person, even when that person was the target, even when understanding them didn't change what needed to happen next. The elevator opened, sub-basement, left corridor, biohazard staging. They moved through it fast and quiet, and when they came to the loading dock door, she put her hand on Dutch's arm to stop him. She listened. Footsteps. One set. Deliberate, measured, the pace of someone moving with purpose but not panic, coming from the left, toward the exterior ramp. She looked at Dutch. He nodded. She pushed through the door. Patricia Hale was 6 feet from the exterior ramp. She was wearing street clothes under a hospital jacket, not her administrative attire, something nondescript, travel-ready. And she had a bag over her shoulder that was the kind of bag that contained exactly what you needed for the first 72 hours of disappearing and nothing else. She heard the door and turned. For a moment, the two women looked at each other across the loading dock, and Elise read Hale's face in the same way she had been reading faces all morning. Fast, complete, without flinching from what she found there. What she found was not what she expected. She expected calculation. She expected the cold, functional assessment of a professional who had been doing this for long enough to have separated themselves from ordinary human response. What she found instead was exhaustion, deep, bone-level exhaustion. The kind that accumulates over years, not hours. The kind that sits in a person's eyes when they have been performing something for so long they can no longer remember what they were performing it over. "I knew you'd be the one," Hale said. Her voice was even, not afraid. Not him. She glanced briefly at Dutch. "You." "Patricia," Elise said. "Don't." Hale shifted the bag on her shoulder. "Don't do the reasonable voice. I've used the reasonable voice. I know what it costs." Something moved in her expression. "I put you in that ER because I needed to watch you, because they told me you were a risk, that your operation 3 years ago had gotten too close, that if you started looking in the right places, you'd find the thread." She paused. "You didn't look. For 14 weeks you kept your head down and you didn't look. And I thought—" "You thought I was done," Elise said. "I thought you were tired," Hale said, "the way I got tired." Another pause, longer this time. "I was right that you were tired. I was wrong about what that meant for you." 8:23, 12 minutes to the next contact window. "The name Marcus Ryle was carrying," Elise said. "He got it right." Something in Hale's face shifted, just slightly, the exhaustion deepening for a moment before the professional composure reclaimed it. "Yes," she said. "How many operations did you compromise?" "Elise, how many?" Hale looked at her. The bag strap moved through her fingers, slow, the unconscious fidget of a person whose hands needed something to do while their mind was doing the hardest kind of work. "More than I can account for now, fewer than they wanted." "People died," Dutch said. His voice was flat. "People always die," Hale said. "On every side of every line. You know that." She looked at Elise. "You know that better than anyone in this building." The weight of that landed in the dock between them. Elise did know it. She had carried it for years, the specific, unresolvable weight of an accounting that never fully balanced. She had set it down along with everything else when she came to this building, this ordinary life, this careful performance of unremarkability. She had told herself that setting it down was not the same as abandoning it, that walking away from the work was not the same as abandoning the people the work had been for. Looking at Patricia Hale now, she wondered, for just a moment, whether the line between those two things was as clear as she had needed it to be. Then she thought about Marcus Ryle on a gurney, bleeding out from a wound that had been engineered by the intelligence Hale had provided to the people who had sent 3 armed men into a hospital. The line was clear enough. "Put the bag down, Patricia," she said. Hale looked at her. A long moment, the particular silence of a decision being made that had been waiting to be made for a long time. "And if I don't," Hale said. "Then I stop you," Elise said. "And I'd rather not do that in a loading dock at 8:24 in the morning." Something that might, in another context, have been a smile crossed Hale's face. "You were never just a nurse," she said. It was not an accusation. It was almost something else, something that sounded, underneath everything, like recognition. Like one person who had been pretending for a very long time, acknowledging another. "No," Elise said, "I wasn't." Hale set the bag down. Dutch moved past Elise, professional and efficient, the restraint out in 3 seconds, and Patricia Hale let it happen with the stillness of someone who had already made their internal peace with the moment. She looked at Elise over Dutch's shoulder while he secured her, and her face was exhausted and complicated and very, very human. "The name I gave to Marcus," Hale said quietly, "my actual handler, the person at the center of the network." She paused. "It's not a foreign asset, it never was." Elise went still. "It's domestic," Hale said. "Someone inside your government. Someone who has been running both sides of this for longer than I have. Longer than anyone has been looking." Her eyes were steady. "I gave Marcus the name because I was done. Because you can only carry something that heavy for so long before it starts to crush the parts of you that were real." She looked at Elise directly. "He's going to need to survive surgery, and when he wakes up, you are going to need to be in that room. Because the only copy of that name that still exists is the one he's carrying in his head." The loading dock was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the hospital was moving. Monitors and voices, and the ordinary machinery of a place where people came to be saved. Somewhere above them, Marcus Riley was on a surgical table with Dr. Maida's hands inside his chest, and the full weight of something much larger than one man's injury resting on whether those hands were good enough. She thought about the name Hale had just told her, the name Marcus was carrying, the person at the center. She looked at Dutch. He looked back at her, and she could see that he understood, at least in part, the scale of what Hale had just said, and that understanding was doing something to his face that it didn't do often. She picked up Hale's bag, handed it to Caldwell, who had appeared in the doorway behind them, having tracked them from the 3rd floor with the quiet efficiency of someone who was very good at his job and had been smart enough to let better people run point. He looked at Hale, then at Elise. "Is she talking?" "She already talked," Elise said. She walked past him, back toward the service elevator, back toward the stairs, back toward the floor where a man she had kept alive this morning was in surgery, carrying a secret that had the potential to change everything. And her hands were steady at her sides, and her heart rate was exactly what it needed to be. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Elise Hargrove, call sign Valkyrie, was done hiding in plain sight. There was work to do. The service elevator moved too slowly on the way up too, but this time she used the time differently. She was not thinking about Patricia Hale anymore. She was not thinking about the loading dock or the bag or the exhaustion in a woman's face that she recognized because she had seen something like it in her own mirror on the worst mornings of the last 14 weeks. She was thinking about a name. The name Hale had handed to Marcus Riley, the name that was currently inside the head of a man on a surgical table on the 4th floor of this building, sedated, cut open, dependent on the precision of hands that did not know what they were protecting. She was thinking about what it meant that the threat was domestic, not foreign, not a network built in another country, operating across borders, funded by interests that were at least cleanly oppositional. Domestic meant inside the government, inside the intelligence structure, inside the apparatus that was supposed to be the thing standing between the American public and exactly the kind of operation that Hale had been running for the last 12 years. It meant the enemy had been writing the rules it was breaking. It meant that every classified operation that had been compromised, every operator who had gone in on intelligence that had been fed through a corrupted channel, every mission that had gone wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by bad luck or bad planning, all of it traced back to a person who sat in a room somewhere in this country and made decisions about which Americans lived and which ones didn't, based on calculations that served no one but themselves. The elevator opened. She stepped out and moved. Caldwell was 2 steps behind her when she came back into the ER. The federal team had arrived during the 15 minutes she had been in the sub-basement. 4 agents in civilian clothes who had taken custody of the 3 restrained men with the quiet efficiency of people who did this regularly and found the paperwork more complicated than the apprehension. The ER was functioning again, or trying to. Staff moving, patients being seen. The particular resilient normality of a place that had been through something and was choosing, professionally and collectively, to keep going. Sandra was at the nurse's station. She looked at Elise when she came through, and the look held everything that the charge nurse had been holding since approximately 7:45 that morning. The questions, the recalibration, the specific kind of reckoning that a precise and intelligent woman undergoes when she discovers that the person she had assessed as the most unremarkable member of her team was not unremarkable at all, and had in fact been the most significant person in the building for the last 14 weeks, without anyone knowing it except the one person who should not have known it. "How's Okafor?" Elise said. "CT was clean. Stitches done. He's refusing to go home." Sandra paused. "He keeps asking if you're all right. Tell him I'm fine." "He won't believe me." "Tell him anyway." She was already moving toward the elevator bank that led to the surgical floors. Caldwell fell into step beside her. "You need to wait for Marcus to come out of surgery before you can—" "I know when he's coming out of surgery," she said. "Dr. Mehta's team is efficient. Given the repair I handed them and the time elapsed, they're closing right now, or they will be in the next 10 minutes. She pressed the elevator button. "What I need from you before I go up is the full operational picture of what Hale told Marcus. Not the summary, everything." Caldwell looked at her. Then he said, 17 months ago, Marcus identified a pattern in 3 separate operations, all compartmentalized, all run through different chains of command, all producing outcomes that were statistically inconsistent with the intelligence provided. He brought it to his commanding officer, who brought it to the intelligence liaison, who turned out to be part of the network, she said. "Who turned out to be the network," Caldwell said. "Not part of it, the architect of it." She looked at him. "The name Hale gave Marcus. You know it." Caldwell was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. "You know it," she said again, not a question this time. "I know it," he said. "And I need you to understand that what happens when Marcus speaks that name out loud in a room with federal witnesses is the beginning of something that is going to be very large, very complicated, and very dangerous for everyone involved in the exposure, including you." "I've been in dangerous situations before," she said. "Not like this one," Caldwell said. "In your previous situations, the threat was external, identifiable. You could see it and move against it. This is different. This person has spent years building institutional protection. When the name comes out, there will be an immediate counter-operation to discredit the source, discredit the evidence, and discredit everyone involved in bringing it forward." He looked at her directly. "Including the nurse from Houston Metropolitan who spent 14 weeks hiding her identity and then spent one morning neutralizing 3 armed men, stabilizing a critical patient with an unauthorized procedure, and apprehending an embedded intelligence asset." He paused. "Your cover is gone, Hargrove. When this goes public, and it will go public, everything you were before this morning goes with it." The elevator came. She stepped in. "I know," she said. She said it quietly, and she said it without hesitation, and she said it the way a person says something that they have already made their peace with, even if the peace was made in the last 4 minutes, rather than over any extended period of careful deliberation. The decision had been made, she understood, the moment she reached for those gloves, the moment she said move and meant it, the moment she stopped performing unremarkability because the cost of the performance had become higher than the cost of being seen. She was seen now. There was no going back to the other thing. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. The surgical waiting area was empty except for Dutch, who was sitting in one of the institutional chairs near the window with his forearms on his knees and his head down, and who looked up when she came in with the face of a man who had been doing the specific kind of waiting that you do when someone you know is on the other side of a set of doors and the outcome is not yet determined. "Any word?" she said. "Meta came out 10 minutes ago, said the repair held, and they were able to address the posterior bleed without complications." He looked at her. She said, and I quote, "Whoever stabilized this patient in the ER bought him the margin he needed. Without that margin, he doesn't make it to the table." She sat down across from him. Not from exhaustion. Her body was still running at operational tempo, the neurochemistry of sustained alert not yet willing to release, but because sitting was the right thing to do in this moment. Because Dutch needed someone to sit across from him, not stand over him. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Yeah." Dutch's jaw tightened. This time. She understood what that meant. It was the same thing she carried, the accumulated weight of the times it had not been all right, the names and faces that sat permanently in the back of a mind that had been trained to retain everything and had never been given a satisfactory protocol for setting down the things that hurt. "Dutch," she said. He looked at her. "Marcus is going to wake up," she said, "and he's going to give Caldwell what he needs. And the name is going to go where it needs to go. It won't be clean. It won't be fast. It's going to be the most complicated thing either of us has ever been adjacent to. And it's going to cost more than we can calculate right now." She held his gaze. "But it's going to happen because he carried it this far, and we are not going to let it stop here." Something in Dutch's face settled. Not relief exactly, but the specific steadying of a person who has found their footing after a long time of feeling the ground move. "When did you decide," he said, "to stop running from it?" She thought about that honestly. "About 40 minutes ago," she said, "when I reached for the gloves." He almost smiled. "That's very you." "Is it?" "The Valkyrie I knew didn't make decisions in advance," he said. "She made them exactly when they needed to be made, and not a second before." He looked at her. "I looked for you, you know, after you left. Not officially, personally." "I know," she said. "You left a very clean trail. I know that too." "Why Houston?" he said. "Of all the places." She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was not simple, and she did not have the habit of giving simple answers to questions that didn't have them. "Because it was far from the coast," she said finally. "Because nobody I knew would think to look in a level 1 trauma center in Texas. Because I was tired in a way that I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been exactly where I'd been. And I needed a place where I could still be useful without being," she paused, "without being what I was." "And were you?" Dutch said. "Useful." She thought about the 14 weeks, the chart updates, the deferred arguments with residents she knew were wrong, the careful, forgettable performance. The supply closet inventory that Dr. Thorne had told her to go do that first morning, 14 weeks ago, as a way of saying, "You don't belong here." "I thought I wasn't," she said. "I thought I was just going through the motions of a life I was pretending to have." She looked at her hands. "Turns out I was watching, the whole time, filed away everything I saw, never stopped reading the room." She paused. "You can take the person out of the work. Apparently you can't take the work out of the person." Dutch nodded slowly. "No," he said, "you can't." The surgical suite doors open. Dr. Priya Mehta came through them with her mask pulled down and her cap still on, and the expression of a surgeon who has done what she came to do and done it well. She saw Elise and walked directly to her. "He's in recovery," Mehta said. "Vitals stable. The posterior repair you initiated held through the entire procedure. We were able to work around it rather than redo it, which saved us approximately 20 minutes of operative time." She paused. And in that pause was the full weight of a precise person saying something she was not accustomed to saying. I've been in this hospital for 11 years. I have never seen a field stabilization of that quality performed outside of a dedicated surgical environment. She held Elise's gaze. Who trained you? People who needed the technique to work the first time, Elise said. Every time. Meta held her gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, with the respect of one person who understood what it meant to be trained to a standard that left no margin for error, and walked back through the doors. Caldwell appeared from the corridor. How long until he's alert enough to speak? 20 minutes, Elise said. Maybe 30. I need to be in that room when he is. So do I, she said. Caldwell looked at her. He looked at Dutch. He looked back at her. This goes to the highest levels, Hargrove. When we walk into that recovery room and Marcus Riley speaks that name, everything changes. For him, for you, for everyone connected to the events of the last 3 years. He was not saying it as a warning. He was saying it as a statement of fact. The way a man says something when he needs the people in the room to understand the full weight of what they are about to do. Are you certain? She stood up. Call it, she said. 22 minutes later, she walked into the recovery room. Marcus Riley was awake. Barely. His eyes were open at half-mast, the sedation still present in the slowness of his movements. The particular disconnected quality of a person whose body was ahead of their consciousness in coming back. But his eyes tracked when she came in, and they tracked with a focus that said something behind them was very much present. She pulled a chair to his bedside and sat down. Dutch stood near the door. Caldwell stood at the foot of the bed. Weston, Claire Weston, his handler for 18 months, the woman who had kept him alive long enough to get here, was beside him on the other side. And when Marcus saw her face, the first thing he did was reach for her hand, slowly, the careful movement of a man whose body had been through something significant. And she let him take it without saying anything, because some things did not need words. Marcus looked at Elise. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they know from a different context, and are placing in this one, working through the gap between where they last saw them and where they are now. She watched him work through it, watched his eyes focus and refocus, and she did not rush it. He had earned the right to take whatever time he needed. Valkyrie, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, just the one word. Hey, Marcus, she said. Something moved across his face, not surprise, more like the particular emotion of a person who had been holding a piece of information in trust and had just found the person it belonged to. You're the one who kept me alive, he said. You kept yourself alive, she said. You made it to the helicopters. Everything after that was just maintenance. He almost laughed. It came out as a breath that had the shape of a laugh. They told me you were done, out, living a normal life somewhere. I was trying, she said. Trying's not the same as done, he said. No, she said, it's not. His hand tightened around Weston's, and he looked at Caldwell, and something in his expression shifted into the focused, deliberate look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was ready to put it down. You need the name, he said. When you're ready, Caldwell said. I've been ready for 6 months, Marcus said. I was just waiting to be in a room where I knew the right people were listening. His eyes moved back to Elise. That's why I said your name. On the bird when I was going under. I knew if I said it and the right people heard it, they'd find you. And if they found you, the room would be right. He paused. I knew about your placement here. I knew Hale had put you in this building. I knew she was watching you. His jaw tightened. I came to Houston specifically because of you, because I needed someone in this building I could trust. And you were already here, and I needed the name to be heard by someone who would know what to do with it. The room was very still. Elise processed that. The full architecture of it, the way Marcus had engineered his own extraction to intersect with this building, this morning, this specific set of circumstances, not because he had no other options, but because he had calculated that this combination of people in this specific moment was the highest probability path to the name surviving the delivery. He had used himself as the delivery mechanism, knowing he might not survive it, and he had built the contingency around her, around Valkyrie. "You used yourself as bait," Dutch said. There was no accusation in it, just the recognition of one person who understood operational logic for another. "I used myself as the message," Marcus said. "The bait was secondary." He coughed once, and Weston adjusted his IV line with quiet efficiency. "There's a difference." "Tell me the name, Marcus," Caldwell said. Marcus looked at Elise one more time. She gave him the smallest nod, the same kind of signal she had given Dutch in the ER, the kind that only means something between people who have learned to communicate in the register beneath speech. He said the name. The name landed in the recovery room, and for a moment, nobody spoke and nobody moved, and the monitors kept their steady rhythm as if the world had not just shifted on its axis in a small room on the 4th floor of a Houston hospital. Caldwell's face did not change, but his hand, which had been resting loose at his side, closed into a fist, slowly, and she watched it happen and understood that he had either already known this name or had suspected it so deeply that confirmation was not surprise, but wait, the difference between a fear and a fact. Dutch said nothing. He was looking at the wall above Marcus's bed with the expression of someone doing very fast and very dark arithmetic. Weston closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them and looked at Marcus with the steady, careful look of a handler who had just heard something that she had been keeping the door open for and was now closing it on everything that came before. Elise sat with the name in her mind and thought about all the places it connected. The operations 3 years ago, the corrupted intelligence, the Eastern node that had been sacrificed deliberately, the 14 weeks of being watched in a building where the person doing the watching had hired her, placed her, kept her close and visible, while the larger mechanism moved around them both. All of it, the full chain of cause and effect, traced back to one person in one position who had been making decisions that moved other people like pieces on a board for longer than any of them had been looking. "How do you want to handle the documentation?" she asked Caldwell. He looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was careful and very precise. "The documentation requires a chain of witness attestation. Marcus is the primary source. You, Dutch, and Weston are secondary attesters. I am the federal receiver." He paused. "This goes to a specific office, not the standard chain. The standard chain has been compromised at 3 points, which is why Marcus routed it this way. The office I'm taking it to is one that even the person whose name we just heard does not have oversight access to." "Does that office know you're coming?" she said. "They will in approximately 4 minutes," Caldwell said, and reached for his phone. She stood up and moved to Marcus's bedside. She looked at him directly, the man who had bled through a field dressing and a Black Hawk helicopter and an ER trauma bay and a surgical suite to get a name into the right room. He looked back at her with the eyes of someone who had done the thing they came to do and was still surprised to be alive for the aftermath. "You should have told me you were coming," she said. "You would have run," he said. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Yeah," she said, "probably. That's why I didn't." He held her gaze. "You saved my life this morning." "You saved it first," she said. 3 years ago, the extraction at the Eastern site. That was you." He was quiet for a moment. "You know about that." "I know enough," she said. "Then we're even," he said. She shook her head. "We're not keeping score." His hand found hers on the bedrail. Not romantic, nothing like that. The grip of one person who has been in the same dark places as another person and understands, without needing to explain it, what it costs to keep going back there when you have already tried to walk away. The grip of someone who is saying, You are not the only one who carries this. She let him hold it for a moment. Then she stood up. Dutch was watching her from near the door. She walked to him. Caldwell's office is going to want statements, she said. Formal, documented, on record. I know. It's going to take months, possibly longer, and the person whose name Marcus just gave is going to fight it every step of the way with every resource they have, which are considerable. I know that too. And my cover is finished, she said. Everything I built in this hospital, the last 14 weeks, it's done. The moment this goes into documentation, the name Hargrove is connected to Valkyrie permanently and publicly, and there is no version of this where I go back to being the quiet rookie nurse who stocks the supply closet. Dutch looked at her steadily. Is that what you want? To go back to that? She thought about it. Genuinely, for a moment, she thought about it. The early mornings, and the carefully messy hair, and the forgettable posture, and the deliberate performance of being someone the room would not look at twice. The charts she updated, and the coffee she drank alone, and the 14 weeks of keeping everything she was buried under everything she was pretending to be. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about whether it had been working. She thought about reaching for the gloves. No, she said. Dutch nodded slowly. Good. She turned back to the room. Marcus was resting, his eyes closed now. The tension of the last 6 months finally releasing from his body in the way that things release when the task is done. Weston was beside him, her hand still in his, watching his face with the expression of someone who had been afraid to look too directly at a good outcome, in case looking at it made it less real. Caldwell was on his phone in the corridor, speaking quietly, and she could see through the window in the door the particular posture of a man who was saying words that he had been waiting a long time to say to the right person. She walked out of the recovery room and into the corridor, and she stood there for a moment with the hospital moving around her, its sounds and its rhythms, and the particular texture of a place that had been doing the same essential work since before she arrived, and would keep doing it after she left. She thought about what came next, the statements and the documentation and the long, grinding, unglamorous work of building a case that could withstand the full force of what would be brought against it. The loss of the ordinary life she had been trying to inhabit, the return to being seen, not as the forgettable rookie, but as whatever she actually was, the full version, the complete one, the person who had spent years in dark places learning things that most people would never need to know, and that had turned out, this morning, to be exactly what was needed. Thorne was in the corridor. She had not heard him come up. He was standing 10 feet away, still in his surgical attire from the trauma bay, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the authority posture. It was not the command face or the dismissive face, or the face he wore when he said, "Sweetheart," and meant, "Stay in your lane." It was just a man's face. Unguarded, a little uncertain, carrying the specific humility of someone who has been wrong in a way that mattered and knows it. "I heard they got her," he said. "Hale." "Yes," Elise said. He was quiet for a moment. "How long did you know about her?" "About 12 minutes longer than I would have liked," she said. He almost smiled. It was a different kind of almost smile than she had seen from him before. Not the sharp, satisfied kind he wore when he was right about something clinical. Something more human than that. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "The 14 weeks," he said. You were always that. What you were this morning, that whole time." "Yes," she said. "And you let me—" He stopped, started again. "You let me treat you the way I did." "It wasn't relevant to the mission," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was complicated and honest and cost him something to show. "It should have been relevant to basic human decency," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "it should have." He nodded, accepting that, not deflecting it or explaining it away. just taking it, the way people take things that are true and necessary to receive. For what it's worth, he said, the technique you used on Ryle, I've already started the documentation. I want it in the hospital's protocol database, properly credited. He paused. It deserves to be in the record. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Dr. Thorne. Julian, he said. She looked at him. Julian, thank you. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the surgical floor, and she watched him go. And she thought that people were, most of them, capable of being better than they had been, when something happened that was large enough to make the cost of staying the same too high. She turned to face the corridor. Caldwell was off his phone. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just put a series of very significant events into motion, and who understood precisely that what happened next was going to require the best of everyone involved. Ready? He said. She thought about the name in the recovery room, the name that Marcus had carried through 6 months of operational work and a Black Hawk extraction and a trauma bay and a surgical suite, and had delivered finally into the right room. The name that was going to pull a thread that would unravel something very large and very old and very deeply embedded in the structure of the thing it had been corrupting from the inside. She thought about Dutch and about Weston and about Marcus's hand on the bedrail and about the particular grip of one person who has been in the dark telling another person that they are not alone there. She thought about 14 weeks of being forgettable. She thought about what she had been before that and what she was now, and whether those two things were as different as she had needed them to be, or whether they had always been the same person, standing in the same body, making the same decision over and over again. When it matters, you move. She looked at Caldwell. I've been ready, she said. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elise Hargrove, call sign Valkyrie, walked down the corridor of Houston Metropolitan Trauma Center and did not look back. Not because there was nothing behind her worth looking at, but because everything that mattered was ahead. And she had never been a person who confused the two.